How does a bomber, crippled and unable to land, save its 10-man crew from a fiery death? When the wheels won't come down and the fuel is nearly gone, what options remain besides a catastrophic crash or a desperate bailout over hostile territory? In the freezing, unforgiving skies of occupied Europe in the winter of 1944, one B-24 Liberator and its crew faced this exact, soul-crushing dilemma. This is not merely a story of mechanical failure, but a saga of raw courage, breathtaking ingenuity, and a chilling, deliberate choice made at 10,000 feet. We are over the jagged, snow-covered peaks of the Austrian Alps, deep in the heart of the Third Reich's defensive perimeter. The mighty 15th Air Force, flying from the hard-won bases of Italy, is striking at the very industries that fuel the Nazi war machine. And aboard a specific B-24J, serial number 4251971, nicknamed the Queen of Hearts, a battle for survival was reaching its terrifying climax. This is the story of how a crippled B-24 landed without wheels, and what the crew did next to cheat death. To understand the sheer desperation of this crew's predicament, we must first comprehend the brutal nature of the strategic air war over southern Europe in late 1944. By November, the 15th Air Force, operating from the Foggia complex in Italy, was systematically dismantling German oil production and industrial targets. The target for November 2, 1944, was the sprawling German aircraft engine factory at Regensburg, a vital component of the Luftwaffe's dwindling strength. Assigned to this punishing mission was the 454th Bombardment Group, Heavy, part of the 304th Bombardment Wing. Their aircraft was the consolidated B-24J Liberator, the Queen of Hearts, a heavy, four-engine bomber known for its long range and capacious bomb bay, but also for its demanding flight characteristics, especially when damaged. Her pilot was First Lieutenant William Bill R. Lawley, Jr., a 23-year-old from Alabama. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant Harry G. Mason. In the glass nose was the bombardier, Second Lieutenant Robert L. Nelson. The navigator was Second Lieutenant George E. Birdsong. Manning the top turret was the flight engineer and top gunner, Technical Sergeant Joseph P. Zarelli. This was a seasoned crew, having flown several previous missions into the teeth of German flak and fighters. They knew the grim arithmetic of their trade. The enemy they faced was a hardened, lethal defense. German flak batteries around Regensburg were some of the most accurate and concentrated in the Reich, employing the dreaded 88mm and 128mm guns. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, could still muster fierce interceptors like the Bf-109 and Fw-190 to slash at the bomber streams. The mission profile was long and dangerous, a deep penetration into Germany, over some of the most formidable mountain terrain in Europe, the Alps. The weather briefing for November 2nd warned of heavy cloud cover over the target, with a high risk of icing. As the crews of the 454th boarded their trucks in the pre-dawn darkness, the tension was a physical weight. Each man performed his own private ritual, checking his parachute harness, his heated suit, his survival kit. They knew that today, the Queen of Hearts would be tested like never before. At 0630 hours, the first of four Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines on the Queen of Hearts coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. One by one, the others followed, filling the hard stand with thunderous noise and swirling prop wash. Following the group's lead aircraft, Lieutenant Lawley guided the heavy bomber onto the taxiway and then to the end of the runway. At precisely 0705 hours, with all four engines screaming at maximum power, the B-24 began its laborious takeoff roll, slowly gaining speed, until the Italian soil fell away, replaced by the azure waters of the Adriatic Sea. The formation assembled, a vast constellation of aluminum and firepower, setting a northeasterly course for the heart of Germany. Escort was provided by long-range P-51 Mustangs, but as with all such missions, there would be moments of vulnerability. The flight across the Adriatic and into the Balkans was tense. Crews in their frigid positions scanned the skies. In the waist, Gunner Staff Sergeants Anthony J. Marchioni and Leo W. Dorsey paced their small spaces, checking and rechecking their twin 50 caliber mounts. In the radio room, Technical Sergeant William A. Roberts monitored the group frequency. In the tail, the most isolated man of all, Staff Sergeant John J. O'Connor, hunched over his guns, watching their contrails stretch back toward safety. The ball turret gunner, Staff Sergeant Charles W. Clanton, was curled in his sphere beneath the aircraft. The flight over Yugoslavia and into southern Germany was marked by sporadic, inaccurate flak. But the real trial lay ahead. As they approached the initial point for the bomb run on Regensburg, the German defenses came alive. The sky ahead, obscured by a thick undercast of cloud, began to erupt with the black, oily puffs of heavy flak. It was box barrages, walls of shrapnel fired into predetermined airspace. Flak, 12 o'clock, heavy and accurate. Came the call over the interphone from the nose. Lally tightened his grip on the control wheel, his eyes fixed on the lead bomber, holding formation despite the concussions that rocked the aircraft. The B-24 bucked and shuddered as near misses exploded with deafening crump sounds. The smell of cordite began to seep into the fuselage. They were on the bomb run now, committed to a straight and level course for what felt like an eternity. Then the fighters came. Bandits. 3 o'clock level. Messerschmitts, shouted Sergeant Zarelli from the top turret, his guns already traversing. A swarm of Bf-109s, some equipped with underwing rockets, streaked through the formation. The air filled with the terrifying crisscross of tracers, red from German cannons, glowing amber from the bombers' 50 calibers. The Queen of Hearts shuddered as her gunners joined the fray. Lally and Mason fought to hold a steady course, the very essence of their duty in these lethal minutes. Inside, the noise was a physical assault, the roar of engines, the hammering of guns, the snap of exploding shells. At approximately 10:20 hours, over the obscured target, Bombardier Nelson released the payload. Bombs away, the B-24 lurched upward, 5 tons lighter. The immediate, visceral reaction was to get out of the flak field. Lally banked the Liberator to the right, joining the turn for the rally point and the long, perilous journey home. But the German gunners, tracking their exit, intensified their fire. The flak seemed even more concentrated on the egress route. The crisis for the Queen of Hearts began just as they thought they were clearing the worst of it. At approximately 10:35 hours, a single, well-aimed 88mm shell found its mark. It did not explode with a direct hit on the fuselage. Instead, it burst just below and ahead of the aircraft's nose. The effect was catastrophic. A storm of white-hot shrapnel ripped through the forward section of the Liberator. The concussion was like being hit by a train. In the cockpit, the windshield and side windows shattered inward. Lally was slammed forward against his harness, sharp fragments tearing into his face, neck, and shoulders. A piece of flak sliced through his leather flight jacket and embedded itself in his right arm. Co-pilot Mason, sitting beside him, took the full force of the blast. He was killed instantly, his body slumping over the controls. Blood and debris sprayed across the instrument panel. Simultaneously, the shrapnel shredded critical systems. Hydraulic lines were severed, sending fluid spraying in fine, oily mists. Electrical cables were sheared, causing a cascade of short circuits and fires. The No. 3 engine, hit by fragments, began to stream thick, black smoke and lose power. Worse, the flak burst had devastated the Bombardier and Navigator's compartment in the nose. Bombardier Nelson was mortally wounded. Navigator Birdsong was severely injured, bleeding profusely. The interphone erupted with screams and frantic calls. Pilot. Nose is hit. Bob and George are down. We've got fires up here. The plane was mortally wounded, filled with smoke, blood, and chaos. Lally, despite his grievous wounds, fought through a wave of shock and pain. He had to regain control. The aircraft, with a dead co-pilot slumped on the controls, a failing engine, and damaged flight surfaces, was beginning a descending turn to the right. With a Herculean effort, using his left hand, he pulled Mason's body off the control column. He then reached across his own body with his wounded right arm, ignoring the searing agony, to grip the wheel. He called for the flight engineer. Zarelli, get up here. I need you on the co-pilot's seat. Mason is gone. Nelson and Birdsong are hit bad. Feather No. 3. The next minutes were a blur of desperate damage control. Zarelli scrambled forward from the top turret, his face a mask of horror at the scene in the cockpit. He helped drag Mason's body from the seat and took his place, immediately assisting with the controls and feathering the stricken engine. Other crew members fought the electrical fires with extinguishers. The waist gunners and radio operator tended to the wounded in the nose as best they could, administering morphine and first aid. But it was clear both Nelson and Birdsong were in dire condition. The aircraft, now flying on 3 engines, was losing altitude and airspeed. They were still deep inside Germany, hundreds of miles from the safety of Allied lines in Italy. The Alps, a towering frozen barrier, lay directly between them and home. Lolly's first priority was to keep the bomber flying. His second was to navigate a path to survival. With the navigator incapacitated and the aircraft systems failing, he made a critical decision. They could not make it back to Italy. The crippled Liberator, losing fuel from damaged tanks, would never clear the Alps. He got on the interphone, his voice strained but clear. "This is the pilot. We cannot make it back to base. We're heading for neutral Switzerland. It's our only chance. Prepare the wounded for a possible bailout or crash landing." Switzerland, though neutral, interned both Allied and Axis aircrews. It was a haven, but reaching it meant flying through some of the most treacherous mountain passes in Europe in a dying aircraft. For the next hour, it was a grueling battle of attrition. Lolly, bleeding and in immense pain, flew the aircraft with Zarelli's help. They nursed the 3 remaining engines, coaxing every ounce of power from them. They descended to find a pass through the Alps, the massive, snow-capped peaks rising around them like the walls of a stone prison. The cold became even more penetrating as the shattered cockpit let in the slipstream. The crew in the back, having subdued the fires, now faced a new, silent threat: the steady drain of fuel from punctured tanks. The gauges were unreliable, but the flight engineers' calculations were grim. They had maybe 30 minutes of flight left if they were lucky. Then, at approximately 11:45 hours, as they struggled through a narrow valley, the next catastrophic failure occurred. Their routine post-crisis checklist included testing the landing gear. "Going to lower gear," Lolly said, his hand moving the lever. They waited. Nothing. No familiar thud, no green indicator lights. The hydraulic system, shredded by flak, was completely gone. The manual hand pump backup was also inoperative, its lines severed. They had no landing gear. The massive B-24, already crippled, carrying dying men and running out of fuel, would have to land on its belly. And they were still over the Alps, with no flat terrain in sight. The realization that they had no wheels transformed their desperate flight into a countdown to a specific, horrific event. A belly landing for a B-24 was notoriously dangerous. The aircraft's deep, slab-sided fuselage and low-mounted wings made it prone to cartwheeling or breaking its back upon impact. With wounded men aboard who could not be easily moved to crash positions, the prospects were bleak. Lolly got on the radio, his signal weak and fading. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Army Bomber Queen of Hearts. We are crippled, multiple wounded and fatalities. No landing gear, attempting to reach Switzerland. Request any assistance." The response was faint from an Allied listening post. "Roger, Queen of Hearts. Your signal is weak. Good luck." They were on their own. The fuel situation was now critical. The engines began to cough and sputter as the tanks ran dry. One by one, the remaining 3 engines failed. First number 4 on the right wing, then number 2. Finally, with a last, gasping shudder, number 1 died. The world became eerily quiet, save for the scream of the wind through the shattered cockpit. The Queen of Hearts was now a 25-ton glider, silent and dying, descending inexorably towards the frozen alpine landscape below. Lolly and Zarelli fought to maintain glide speed and control. Below them, through breaks in the cloud, they saw not the welcome flat fields of the Swiss plateau, but the steep, wooded slopes and rocky outcrops of the Alps' lower foothills. They were not going to make Switzerland. They were going down in Germany or in the no-man's land of the high mountains. The choice was now between bailing out over hostile, mountainous terrain in winter or attempting a controlled crash landing. Bailing out meant leaving the mortally wounded bombardier and navigator behind, an unthinkable act for the crew. It also meant capture for the able-bodied, an almost certain death from exposure for anyone who landed injured in the snow. "We're taking her down," Lolly said, his voice etched with pain and finality. "I'll try to find a spot. Everyone brace. Get the wounded secured as best you can." The crew scrambled. They used parachute harnesses and straps to tie the wounded men to their stations. The able-bodied assumed crash positions in the radio room and waist, backs against forward bulkheads, legs braced. Lolly and Zarelli remained at the controls, harnesses locked tight. The ground rushed up with terrifying speed. Lolly spotted a narrow, snow-covered alpine meadow, barely long enough, nestled between 2 stands of dark pine trees. It was their only chance. He lowered full flaps to reduce speed as much as possible, fighting the sluggish controls. The silence was deafening. The trees at the end of the meadow grew larger, impossibly fast. With a thunderous, grinding impact that shook the very mountains, the Queen of Hearts met the earth. The first point of contact was the bomb bay and lower fuselage. The sound was a monstrous, sustained shriek of tearing metal. The aircraft plowed through the deep snow, which offered some cushioning but also created tremendous drag. The forward momentum carried the shattered bomber for hundreds of yards, shearing off the ball turret, ripping open the belly. Inside, the crew were thrown about like ragdolls. Equipment broke free and became lethal projectiles. The noise was apocalyptic, a roaring, ripping, crushing cacophony that promised oblivion. Then, with a final, groaning lurch, the B-24 slewed to the right and came to a stop, tilted at a sickening angle. The silence that followed was broken only by the ping of cooling metal, the hiss of steam, and the moans of the injured. For a moment, no one moved, stunned by the violence of the stop. Then, Lawley's voice, weak but commanding, cut through the haze. Report. Sound off. One by one, the crew responded from their positions. Miraculously, besides the already fatal and severe wounds in the nose, the rest of the crew had survived the crash. They were battered, bruised, and in shock, but alive. The sturdy airframe of the Liberator, though destroyed, had absorbed the impact and saved their lives. But their ordeal was far from over. They were in the German Alps in winter. The aircraft was wrecked and already beginning to burn in small electrical fires. They had wounded comrades who needed immediate medical attention, and they were deep behind enemy lines. The fear of capture was immediate. German troops or local militia would have heard and seen the crash. They had minutes, maybe less, before they would be descended upon. In that moment of post-crash shock, facing capture, freezing temperatures, and their wounded friends, the crew of the Queen of Hearts made a collective, defiant decision. They would not wait to be captured. They would not abandon their comrades. They would attempt an escape and evasion through the Alps to neutral Switzerland. It was an audacious, nearly insane plan. They were in unfamiliar, mountainous territory in winter with wounded men, no proper gear, and the German army surely alerted. But the alternative, a POW camp for the healthy and likely death for the severely wounded without proper care, was unacceptable. Leadership fell to the more able-bodied crew members, particularly the gunners. Staff Sergeant Marchioni took charge. We can't stay here. The Germans will be coming. We have to move. We head south towards Switzerland. The first task was to care for the wounded. Navigator Birdsong, though gravely injured, was still alive. Bombardier Nelson had succumbed to his wounds shortly after the crash. With immense care and using pieces of the wreckage, they fashioned 2 crew litters from parachute shrouds and broken aluminum spars. They placed Birdsong on one. The body of Lieutenant Mason, their co-pilot, was respectfully covered and left in the cockpit. They could not carry him. Lieutenant Lawley, despite his own serious wounds, refused to be carried. I can walk, he insisted, though he leaned heavily on Sergeant Zarelli. They scavenged what they could from the wreck in mere minutes. A first aid kit, parachute silk for blankets, a few ration bars from a survival kit, a compass from the navigator station. Then, they set the aircraft on fire to prevent its capture and use by the Germans. As flames began to lick through the shattered fuselage, the 9 surviving crewmen, 8 able-bodied and 1 on a litter, stumbled away from the burning wreckage into the dense, snow-laden pine forest. It was approximately 12:30 hours. Their journey had just begun. What followed was a 3-day odyssey of sheer human endurance. They moved only at night, using the stars to guide them south. During the day, they hid in thickets or shallow caves they dug in the snow, huddling together for warmth under the parachute silk. The cold was a constant, bone-deep enemy. Their flight suits were inadequate for a winter alpine survival march. They melted snow in their mouths for water. The few ration bars were divided meticulously. Lieutenant Birdsong's condition worsened, and they took turns carrying his litter through the deep snow, an exhausting, heartbreaking task that slowed their progress to a crawl. They avoided all signs of habitation, giving wide berth to any mountain huts or distant village lights. The sound of a dog barking or an engine in a far-off valley would send them diving for cover, hearts pounding. On the second day, they had a close call. A German patrol on skis, likely searching for them, passed within 100 yards of their hiding place. They lay motionless in the snow, barely breathing, until the sounds faded. The stress was immense, a constant, grinding fear layered on top of exhaustion, cold, and hunger. The turning point came on the afternoon of the 3rd day, November 5th. Weak, frostbitten, and on the verge of collapse, the group crested a ridge. Below them, in a valley, they saw a small cluster of wooden buildings with a distinctive flag. the white cross on a red background of Switzerland. They had made it, but between them and that sanctuary was an open, snow-covered slope and a guarded border. They had to cross in daylight. They could not spend another night in the open. Gathering their last reserves of strength, they made a desperate, stumbling dash down the slope towards the Swiss border post. Shots in German rang out from a nearby watchtower. The shot was fired into the air as a warning. The crew, waving a makeshift white flag made from parachute cloth, kept moving, half carrying, half dragging their wounded. Swiss border guards, seeing the clearly distressed and injured men, advanced cautiously. Recognizing them as Allied airmen, they lowered their weapons and rushed to help, taking the litter from the exhausted Americans. The crew of the Queen of Hearts had escaped. They were now in their knees, but they were alive, and their wounded would receive medical care. The Swiss authorities provided medical treatment for Lieutenant Lally, Navigator Birdsong, and the others suffering from frostbite and exposure. Tragically, George Birdsong, who had clung to life through the 3-day ordeal, succumbed to his wounds in a Swiss hospital several days later. The final toll was devastating. Co-pilot Harry Mason and bombardier Robert Nelson were killed in the initial flak burst. Navigator George Birdsong died of his wounds after the escape. 7 men survived. Pilot William Lally, flight engineer Joseph Zarelli, radio operator William Roberts, gunners Anthony Marchioni, Leo Dorsey, John O'Connor, and Charles Clinton. Their story, when relayed through the Swiss Red Cross and eventually back to the 454th Bomb Group, was met with awe. The sheer tenacity, surviving the catastrophic flak hit, the death of key crew members, flying a crippled plane without a co-pilot, crashing in the Alps, and then executing a successful multi-day escape and evasion to neutral territory, was almost beyond belief. It was a testament to Lieutenant Lally's incredible piloting skill and leadership under unimaginable duress, and to the crew's unbreakable cohesion and will to survive. For his actions on November 2, 1944, First Lieutenant William R. Lally, Jr. was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation detailed his extraordinary courage. Despite severe wounds, he took control of the aircraft after his co-pilot was killed, refused to bail out and abandon. His wounded crewman successfully crash-landed the crippled bomber, and then led his crew on the arduous escape to Switzerland. His devotion to his crew above his own life embodied the highest ideals of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Sergeant Joseph Zarelli received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his vital assistance in the cockpit and throughout the ordeal. The legacy of the Queen of Hearts and her crew is multifaceted. It is a stark reminder of the horrific casualties of the bombing campaign, 3 young men lost on a single mission. It is a story of supreme airmanship in the face of mechanical and human catastrophe. But perhaps most powerfully, it is a story of post-crash survival and loyalty. In an era when bailout was often the only prescribed survival tactic for a crippled bomber, this crew chose a different path. They chose to stay together, to carry their wounded, and to fight for every mile towards freedom. Their 3-day trek through the Winter Alps stands as one of the most remarkable escape and evasion stories of the air war in Europe. It underscores a profound truth. Sometimes, the greatest heroism occurs not in the cockpit during combat, but in the frozen silence afterward, in the decision to keep moving, to carry your comrades, and to never, ever give up. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII-Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.